February 14th, 2026. 2:47 a.m. Central Russia. 3 cruise missiles, 1 defense plant, 0 warning. By 2:51 a.m., the production line responsible for building guidance systems used in Russian cruise missiles no longer existed. Secondary explosions lit up the night sky for 11 minutes. Commercial satellite imagery captured the glow from orbit. Russia called it an act of NATO aggression. Ukraine called it self-defense. The missiles didn't care about the politics. They did exactly what they were designed to do. I'm your host at Warfist TV, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're breaking down one of the most consequential deep strike operations of the entire conflict, a coordinated Storm Shadow cruise missile attack on a Russian military-industrial facility that produced the very weapons Russia was using to terrorize Ukrainian cities. Because this wasn't just a missile strike. This was Ukraine reaching inside Russia's war machine and ripping out a vital organ. Let's start from the beginning. For months before the strike, Ukrainian military intelligence had been watching. Not just watching, cataloging. Every shipment, every supply truck, every shift change at a defense plant located deep inside Russian territory, well beyond the front lines, well beyond the range of most Ukrainian weapons. The facility was responsible for 2 critical outputs. First, guidance modules for Russian Kh-101 cruise missiles, the same weapons that had been slamming into Ukrainian apartment buildings, hospitals, and power stations since the early months of the war. Second, assembly components for Shahed-type one-way attack drones, the Iranian-designed weapons Russia had been producing domestically under license since late 2023. Ukrainian intelligence officers tracked production output through a combination of signals intelligence, satellite imagery, and human sources inside Russia's defense sector. What they found was alarming. Between October and December 2025, the facility's output had increased by an estimated 40%. More trucks were arriving. More finished components were leaving. The plant was running double shifts. Which weapon system posed the greatest threat from this facility? A. Kh-101 cruise missiles. B. Shahed-type drones. C. Both equally. Drop your answer in the comments. The correlation was direct and measurable. Every spike in production at this facility was followed, roughly 3 to 4 weeks later, by an increase in Russian aerial attacks on Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian air defense commanders had noticed the pattern. In November 2025, after a particularly brutal wave of strikes that hit energy infrastructure across 6 oblasts, Ukrainian General Staff made a decision. The facility had to be neutralized, not degraded, not damaged, destroyed. The problem was distance. The plant sat deep inside Russian territory. HIMARS couldn't reach it. ATACMS couldn't reach it. Even Neptune cruise missiles, which Ukraine had been developing and deploying with increasing success, lacked the range for this particular target. There was only one weapon in Ukraine's arsenal capable of making this shot: Storm Shadow. The MBDA Storm Shadow is a British-French air-launched cruise missile originally designated Scalp EG by France. It weighs approximately 1,300 kilograms. Its range exceeds 250 kilometers, some variants reportedly reaching well beyond that figure, though exact numbers remain classified. The missile flies at low altitude, hugging terrain features using an advanced navigation system that combines inertial guidance, GPS, and terrain reference matching. In its terminal phase, it uses an infrared imaging seeker to identify and strike precise aim points on a target. Its warhead is the BROACH system, Bomb Royal Ordnance Augmented Charge. This is a tandem warhead. The first stage is a shaped charge penetrator that punches through reinforced concrete, hardened shelters, or industrial roofing. The second stage is a follow-through bomb that detonates inside the structure after penetration. The combination is devastating against hardened or buried targets. Ukraine received its first batch of Storm Shadow missiles from the United Kingdom in mid-2023. Since then, they've been used sparingly but effectively. Each missile costs approximately $2.5 million, and Ukraine's stockpile is finite. Every shot has to count. For this mission, every shot would count. Stay with me. What happens over the next few minutes of this breakdown will show you how Ukraine executed one of the most precise deep strike operations of the war. Planning for the strike began in late January 2026. Ukrainian Air Force commanders worked in coordination with military intelligence to build a target package. This wasn't a matter of simply programming coordinates into a missile and launching. A successful Storm Shadow strike against a defended target deep inside Russia required solving multiple simultaneous problems. Problem 1. Penetrating Russian air defenses. The flight path from Ukrainian-controlled territory to the target crossed multiple layers of Russian integrated air defense. S-400 battalions, S-300 batteries, Book M3 medium-range systems, Pantsir S-1 point defense units positioned around high-value facilities. The Russian air defense network in this region was dense and active. Problem 2. Launch platform survivability. The Storm Shadow would be launched from Ukrainian Su-24M bombers, Soviet-era variable geometry strike aircraft that Ukraine had modified to carry Western ordnance. The Su-24M is not stealthy. It shows up clearly on radar. Any launch aircraft that flew too close to Russian air defense coverage would be engaged and likely destroyed before it could release its weapons. Problem 3. Timing. The strike needed to hit the facility when maximum damage could be inflicted, meaning when finished components were staged inside production halls, ready for shipment. Ukrainian intelligence had identified a pattern. Shipments typically left the facility on Tuesdays and Fridays. Components accumulated inside the production halls in the days prior. February 14th was a Friday. Intelligence indicated a major shipment was scheduled for that morning. The production halls would be full. The mission was approved on February 12th. 2 days to final preparation. Ukrainian Air Force ground crews began preparing the Su-24M aircraft at a dispersed airfield in western Ukraine. The Storm Shadow missiles were brought from secure storage, their guidance systems programmed with the target coordinates, waypoints, and terrain-matching data for the ingress route. Each missile's mission plan was verified independently. Any error in the flight path programming could send the weapon off course or into a Russian air defense engagement zone. The flight plan called for a low-altitude approach. The Su-24M bombers would fly west initially, away from the front lines, before turning north and then east, taking a circuitous route designed to avoid the densest concentrations of Russian radar coverage. The bombers would stay below 100 meters altitude for most of the flight, using terrain masking to hide from S-400 surveillance radars that can detect targets at ranges exceeding 400 kilometers. The launch point was calculated precisely. The bombers needed to get close enough to release the missiles within their effective range, but far enough from Russian air defenses to have a reasonable chance of surviving the mission and returning to base. The pilots would not cross into Russian airspace. The missiles would. February 14th, 1:30 a.m. local time. 2 Su-24M bombers taxied onto the runway at the dispersed airfield. No lights, no radio communications. The aircraft had been loaded hours earlier, each carrying a single Storm Shadow missile under its fuselage. A third Su-24M carrying a second Storm Shadow launched from a separate location 12 minutes later. The bombers climbed to their initial cruise altitude, then descended rapidly, dropping below radar coverage as they headed toward their launch coordinates. The pilots flew using terrain-following radar, their aircraft skimming treetops and river valleys in complete darkness. At 2:14 a.m., the first Su-24M reached its launch point. The weapons officer confirmed target lock. The Storm Shadow dropped free from the aircraft's centerline pylon, its turbojet engine igniting seconds later. The missile's wings deployed, and it began its autonomous flight toward the target, descending to its cruise altitude, barely 30 meters above the ground. The second missile launched at 2:17 a.m., the third at 2:26 a.m. from the second aircraft. 3 missiles, 3 slightly different flight paths, all converging on the same facility. How many Storm Shadow missiles were launched in this operation? A. 2, B. 3, C. 5. The answer comes at the end. The Storm Shadow's flight profile is designed for survivability. At low altitude, the missile presents a minimal radar cross-section against ground clutter. Its navigation system constantly adjusts the flight path, using stored digital terrain elevation data to keep the missile hidden behind ridgelines and below radar horizons. The turbojet engine is relatively quiet compared to a rocket motor, and the missile's radar signature at low altitude is comparable to a large bird. Russian air defense operators would have had extremely limited warning. The S-400's primary surveillance radar excels at detecting high-altitude targets. Against a terrain-hugging cruise missile approaching at low altitude, detection ranges shrink dramatically. The S-300 systems positioned along the route faced similar challenges. At 2:44 a.m., the first Storm Shadow entered its terminal attack phase. The missile climbed briefly, gaining altitude to initiate its final dive, and the infrared seeker activated, scanning the target area. The seeker matched the thermal image it detected against stored reference images of the facility. Target confirmed, the missile dove. At 2:47 a.m., the BROACH warhead punched through the facility's industrial roofing. The shaped charge precursor blasted a hole through reinforced concrete. The follow-through warhead detonated inside the production hall. 23 seconds later, the second missile struck. Different aim point, same building complex. The warhead detonated inside what satellite imagery would later suggest was a component storage area. The third missile hit at 2:51 a.m., impacting an adjacent structure that Ukrainian intelligence had identified as an assembly and testing facility. Subscribe to Warfist TV if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. 3 impacts. 4 minutes. The facility's 2 primary production halls were gutted. Then, the secondary explosions began. At 2:53 a.m., the first secondary detonation was recorded. Then another at 2:55 a.m. and another. Over the next 11 minutes, satellite-based infrared sensors detected at least 7 distinct secondary explosions emanating from the facility. The thermal signatures were enormous, far larger than the initial warhead detonations alone would produce. Ukrainian intelligence analysts concluded that the missiles had struck areas where finished warhead components, propellant charges, or explosive materials were stored. The secondaries were the facility's own inventory destroying itself. It was the best possible outcome. By 3:15 a.m., the entire facility complex was engulfed in fire. Commercial satellite imagery, available within hours through Planet Labs and Maxar, showed massive thermal blooms covering the site. Structural damage was visible even in medium-resolution imagery. At least 2 production halls had suffered catastrophic roof collapse. A third structure was burning uncontrollably. All 3 Su-24M bombers returned safely to Ukrainian-controlled airspace. Not a single aircraft was engaged by Russian air defenses during the mission. 0 Ukrainian losses. 0. The Russian response was immediate and furious. Within hours, the Kremlin issued a statement describing the attack as a direct act of NATO aggression. The statement specifically named the United Kingdom as bearing responsibility for authorizing the use of Storm Shadow missiles against targets on Russian soil. Russia's foreign ministry summoned the British ambassador. State television broadcast footage of the burning facility, though the commentary focused entirely on blaming Western nations rather than acknowledging the military significance of the target. If you believe tactics win wars, type Warfist TV in the comments. The Russian Defense Ministry initially claimed that air defenses had intercepted 2 of the missiles and that only minor damage had been inflicted. This claim collapsed within 24 hours when high-resolution satellite imagery became publicly available, showing complete destruction of the main production halls. Open-source analysts quickly identified the facility and cataloged the damage. The Russian narrative of successful interception was demonstrably false. More importantly for Ukraine, the strike's effects were measurable and immediate. In the 2 weeks following the February 14th attack, Russian cruise missile launches against Ukrainian territory dropped by an estimated 35 to 40% compared to the preceding 2-week period. Ukrainian air defense commanders reported fewer Kh-101 engagements. The pattern was consistent with a disruption in guidance component supply. Without finished seekers and navigation modules, completed missile airframes sitting in Russian arsenals couldn't be made ready for launch. Ukrainian defense officials were blunt in their assessment. Major General Vadim Sukharevsky, speaking at a press conference on February 21st, stated that destroying production capacity at the source was vastly more efficient than intercepting finished weapons in flight. He cited the mathematics directly. A single Storm Shadow missile costing $2.5 million had destroyed a facility producing guidance components worth tens of millions of dollars. More critically, every component destroyed at the factory represented 1 fewer missile aimed at Kyiv, Kharkiv, or Odessa. The cost-benefit analysis was overwhelming. 3 Storm Shadow missiles, approximately $7.5 million total, had eliminated a production capacity that would have generated hundreds of millions of dollars in finished weapons over the coming months. and every destroyed guidance unit meant one fewer cruise missile slamming into Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. What would NATO have done differently in planning this strike? Share your tactical analysis in the comments. The diplomatic fallout was significant but contained. The United Kingdom declined to confirm or deny its role in authorizing the strike, maintaining its standard policy of not commenting on specific operational decisions. British Defense Secretary John Healey stated only that the UK had provided Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine for use in self-defense, and that Ukraine made its own operational decisions about their employment. Behind the scenes, however, Western intelligence officials were reportedly impressed by the operation's execution. The combination of intelligence preparation, flight planning, timing, and target selection demonstrated a level of deep strike capability that Ukraine had been building for over a year. This wasn't a lucky shot. This was a mature military planning process producing consistent results. Russia's threat of a new level of escalation was taken seriously in Western capitals, but analyzed carefully. Russian officials had made similar threats before. After Ukraine first used Storm Shadow against targets in Crimea, after ATAK-MS strikes on Russian airbases, after naval drone attacks on Black Sea Fleet vessels. In each case, the threatened escalation had not materialized in the form implied. Russia had retaliated with increased missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, but had not fundamentally altered the conflict's escalation dynamics. Western analysts assessed that Russia's options for meaningful escalation were constrained. A direct military response against NATO member states would trigger Article 5, collective defense. Increased conventional strikes against Ukraine were already at near maximum sustainable rates, limited by Russia's own production capacity and stockpiles. The nuclear option remained in the background, but no Western intelligence agency assessed that the threshold for nuclear use had been approached. For Ukraine, the strategic logic was unassailable. The country was fighting an enemy that was systematically destroying its civilian infrastructure from the air. Russian cruise missiles and drones had killed thousands of Ukrainian civilians, destroyed power plants, water treatment facilities, hospitals, and residential buildings. Striking the facilities that produced these weapons was the most direct form of self-defense available. The February 14th operation also demonstrated something that military planners on both sides had been watching carefully. Ukrainian Su-24M bombers, aircraft designed in the 1960s, built in the 1970s and 1980s, had successfully penetrated deep enough into contested airspace to launch standoff weapons against a heavily defended target. The key was not the aircraft's capability. The Su-24M is old, slow by modern standards, and lacks stealth characteristics. The key was mission planning, route selection, and the exploitation of gaps in Russian radar coverage. Ukrainian pilots had become experts at flying low-altitude profiles through Russian air defense networks. They used terrain masking, they exploited known gaps between radar coverage zones, and they timed their missions to coincide with periods of reduced Russian air defense alertness. This institutional knowledge, built over years of combat experience, was as valuable as the missiles themselves. The lessons from the February 14th strike are clear, and they reshape our understanding of how deep strike operations function in this conflict. First, production facilities are high-value, high-payoff targets. Destroying a single factory can have greater strategic impact than intercepting dozens of individual weapons. Second, standoff weapons like Storm Shadow enable strikes that would otherwise be impossible. Without the missile's range and autonomous guidance, Ukraine could not have reached this target. Third, intelligence preparation is everything. The months of surveillance, pattern analysis, and timing optimization transformed a missile strike into a strategic operation. The missiles didn't just hit a building, they hit the right building at the right time with maximum inventory inside. Fourth, Russia's integrated air defense network, while formidable, has exploitable gaps. Low-altitude terrain-following profiles remain effective against even modern Russian radar systems. The S-400 is not the impenetrable shield Russia claims it to be. Fifth, the economic mathematics of deep strike favor Ukraine. A $7.5 million investment in 3 missiles destroyed production capacity worth hundreds of millions. That ratio, if sustained, fundamentally alters the resource equation of the war. Now, the answer to our earlier question. How many Storm Shadow missiles were launched in this operation? The answer is B, 3. 3 missiles, launched from 2 Su-24M bombers, struck the facility within a 4-minute window. All 3 penetrated the target. All 3 detonated successfully. The BROACH tandem warheads performed exactly as designed, penetrating hardened industrial structures and detonating inside production areas. 3 missiles, 1 facility. Weeks of reduced Russian air attacks on Ukrainian cities. That is the definition of strategic impact. So consider this. Was the decision to strike this specific facility the right call, given the limited Storm Shadow stockpile? Could Russia have prevented this attack with better air defense positioning around critical industrial sites? And what would you have done differently if you were planning Ukraine's deep strike campaign? Subscribe to Warfist TV, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The facility sits quiet now. The production halls are gutted shells, their roofs collapsed, their machinery destroyed. Satellite imagery shows cleanup vehicles around the perimeter, but the structures themselves are beyond repair. Russia will rebuild eventually. They always do. But the guidance components that were supposed to become cruise missiles aimed at Ukrainian families will never be built. And somewhere in Ukraine, a city that would have been struck sleeps through the night in peace. Real tactics. Real consequences. Warfist TV.